The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect the policies and the position of Now You Know.
Good evening and welcome to Viewpoint. Together with experts and newsmakers, we'll make sense of the week's biggest issues and stories. I'm Barnaby Lo in tonight's conversation.
It was an unexpected but welcome surprise for Filipinos. President Rodrigo Duterte invoking an international court ruling invalidating China's encompassing claims in the South China Sea for the first time, and before a United Nations Assembly at that. This comes after years of setting aside the Philippines' victory in 2016 against China over sea claims, and a foreign policy that has drawn the two countries closer. Duterte's statement has been met, however, with flat-out rejection from China. The outspoken Philippine leader also defended his administration's human rights record. In the same speech, he said he welcomes constructive engagement with the UN. But later in the week, his spokesperson, Secretary Harry Roque, said UN human rights investigators are not welcome to visit the country. These, while the Duterte government continues to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, issues of corruption and transparency, and the environment.
And with us tonight to talk about the most pressing national issues is Presidential Spokesperson Secretary Harry Roque. He's live with us via Skype, and I believe he is live from Baguio City. Good evening, Secretary Roque.
Good evening, Barnes, and good evening to everyone.
So first question, how's the weather in Baguio?
Excellent. It hasn't really been raining, which is good because on the evening that we arrived here on yesterday, Friday, it was really heavy, raining very, very heavily.
That's good because we all thought that we might not have a good signal to be able to do this show this weekend, but it looks like we have a good enough signal to be able to do this. Okay, so let's get into the issues. First, Secretary Roque, I'd like to get your reaction. And possibly, I don't know if President Duterte has already heard, but either your reaction or President Duterte's reaction to the reaction of Chinese ambassador to the Philippines, Huang Xilian, to President Duterte's speech before the United Nations General Assembly, of course, about the 2016 arbitral win of the Philippines. Ambassador Huang saying that reiterating that China doesn't recognize the arbitral ruling that the Philippines won back in 2016, also saying that there is an agreement between President Xi Jinping and President Duterte to shelve maritime disputes.
You see, although the opposition has been basically praising the president for what they say is a change policy, a new policy on China and on the arbitral award, the truth of the matter was the president was just being consistent with his position on the arbitral ruling. It just so happens that this is the first time that he addressed the General Assembly, and it was the first time for the president to articulate what has been his consistent position. That the arbitral ruling is now part of international law, that it is actually binding on China because China, when it ratified the UNCLOS, ratified also the dispute settlement procedure embodied in UNCLOS, which is they will either refer the matter to the ICJ or to the UN Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and if they did not choose which mode specifically, will resolve any pending disputes arising from interpretation or application of the treaty, then the default procedure would be ad hoc arbitration, which is what we did under the auspices of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Now, China, for its part, has also been consistent because it's been saying that it did not specifically give its consent to the arbitration, and therefore it is not bound by the arbitral award. Of course, this was addressed by the tribunal itself, and there is a principle in international law that the tribunal shall be the sole judge of its own jurisdiction. And the court ruled that, as I said earlier, no, China in fact gave its consent to the arbitration because it ratified and became party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea without specifying which tribunal, the ICJ or the ITLOS, will resolve all disputes submitted no, for resolution. So I think the Philippines and China are both being consistent with their policies. I'm not surprised by the statement of the Chinese officer. That has always been their position. And the agreement is because we cannot resolve the pending territorial dispute, we will proceed with matters that we could proceed. And this includes matters such as trade and investments, setting aside for the time being resolution of the territorial dispute.
So, ibig sabihin po ba, Secretary Roque, that after the speech of the President at the UN General Assembly, wala na pong gagawin? Kumbaga, that is how far he is asserting our rights in the West Philippine Sea? Because there have been suggestions now, for example, to put this to a vote at the UN General Assembly. And I know you've already rejected this, pero because sabi ninyo na pag ginawa natin yon, baka matalo pa tayo doon. Pero experts are saying na, I mean, not necessarily daw na pwedeng matalo yung Pilipinas and that it's worth a try because, for example, Mauritius beat the UK at the UN General Assembly last year over a dispute over the Chagos Islands.
Well, I wouldn't really compare us with Mauritius and England because England, after all, is really a spent superpower. No? We know that they had their greatness in the past, but that's no longer true today. And China is admittedly the new superpower, no? Because of its economy and because of its rising influence, and also because of its what is referred to as smiling diplomacy, no? But I think there's only been an instance where the UN General Assembly acted on a matter involving a threat to international peace, and that was the creation of the peacekeeping forces in Congo. No? Normally, this would fall within the powers of the Security Council, but the ICJ, in ruling that the Uniting for Peace resolution was legal, said, yes, it is a primary jurisdiction of the Security Council, but it does not have a monopoly, and that the GA can in fact exercise its power. The problem with the GA is it is a political organ of the United Nations, and issues there will be decided by states not on the basis of law, but on the basis of politics. And that is what I meant by, I think we stand a very difficult task to win politically over China, what with China's new influence over many nations, particularly Africa, no, and other developing states. No? And of course, Secretary Locsin has already said, why will we reopen that victory no? When we already have it etched in stone? No? So it doesn't make sense if you will reopen it in a political body such as the General Assembly.
So
now, I'd like to dispute that these are the views of experts. Former Justice Antonio Carpio has never been an authority in international law. And of course, former Secretary de Rosario is not even a lawyer. No? He was Secretary of Foreign Affairs for 6 years. That does not make him an authority or an expert in the field of international law or in the field of international organizations. I don't think he has really a competence as far as the United Nations is concerned. So I wouldn't take their words as expert opinions. I would take them as ordinary opinions of laymen.
Mm-hmm. I was talking about experts such as Greg Pauling. But in any case, I want to clarify. So the Philippines isn't going to even raise the issue with the UN General Assembly or have the UN General Assembly put this to a vote. No.
I don't think we stand a chance for another Uniting for Peace resolution. No? Because as I said, countries will vote on political lines, not on the issue of legality. Whereas the tribunal ruled on an issue of legality already.
Okay, so what then will the Philippine government do to follow through on that speech or statement by President Duterte? Because I'm asking this because people or critics in particular might construe the speech as just mere lip service. You know, that after that speech, that after that strong statement, then nothing follows. Then if that happens, then it's just status quo, right?
That's the difference between international law and domestic law. Unlike domestic law, where you have a police force or a sheriff to enforce domestic court decisions, you don't have one in the international community. At most, as I said, there is Chapter 7, collective security measures under the UN, threats to international peace, where the UN Security Council itself can authorize either military or non-military sanctions against a country guilty of a threat to international peace. No? Now, much of international law relies on the commitment of states to comply and abide with the international obligations. Now, does this make international law any less a law? Of course not. Because even in the Philippines, we do have laws which do not provide for penal sanctions and yet are recognized as binding, such as civil laws. But in the international community, the mere fact that the decision exists is the enforcement by itself, because according to Article 38 of the Charter of the International Court of Justice, arbitral tribunals, being writings of the most qualified publicists, are subsidiary sources of international law, no? Meaning they provide us evidence of what is the applicable customary norm in a given controversy. No? And because it is already a source of international law, we don't need to do anything. As the president said, it now forms part of international law. That is perfect enforcement by itself.
Okay, so just to be clear, the Philippine government isn't going to do anything anymore, but how about the rhetoric? Will the president continue with the rhetoric?
It's not rhetoric. It's a consistent position. There's nothing that they can do to erase our victory. There's nothing that they can do to erase the fact that the most highly qualified publicists have said that the claim to a big part of the South China Sea on the basis of historic claims to waters is illegal. And there's nothing that China can do with a decision that says that the islands, that they build the artificial islands on waters comprising our exclusive economic zone. So again, in international law, the existence of the award by itself is the enforcement. Of course, China will deny, but take note that China has never said that the UNCLOS is not binding, which indicates that they recognize the binding nature of UNCLOS as part of customary law, whether or not they in fact ratified UNCLOS itself. No?
Okay, last question on this. Practically speaking then, how can the Philippines gain back control of parts of the West Philippine Sea that China has gained control over? In other words, how can Filipino fishermen go out and fish in peace, without getting harassed? How can Filipinos operate, economic activities? How can the Philippine military operate in the area without, the Chinese breathing down their necks all the time?
We would have to distinguish where they would want to fish. In the Scarborough Shoal or Panatag, the arbitral ruling is actually recognized and being enforced by China. And they recognize that there's a sort of condominium as far as fishing is concerned in Panatag, because all fishermen from the Philippines, China, and Vietnam can fish there. And to the extent that China has now allowed Filipino fishermen to fish there, they have recognized the arbitral award. No? Now, in the Spratlys, there's really not much of a problem in the Spratlys, no? Although you hear from time to time the fact that Chinese gunboats are intimidating our fishermen. No? But the reality really is, number one, the arbitral award exists. Number two, because we are maintaining friendly ties with China, despite the fact that we have, kumbaga, meron tayong alas against China because we have won the litigation, no? It makes things easier for our people. No? And that is why through friendly relations, I think the fishermen are able to engage in their livelihood now. No? Compare this during the time of Del Rosario himself, no? When they were completely thrown out of Scarborough and Spratlys. No? So since the friendly relations established by President Duterte, that's when my clients, because these fishermen have been my clients, no, have been allowed to engage in their livelihood again.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Friendly relations, and bolstered by the fact that there's nothing that China can do that can erase our victory.
Okay. Now, on the UN speech, still on the UN speech, President Duterte touched on the Duterte administration's human rights record. And he said, and I quote, to move forward, open dialogue and constructive engagement with the United Nations is key. But this must be done with the principle of non-interference. And earlier this week, after that speech, you had said that the government would not let UN human rights rapporteurs into the country. So, I mean, what does that mean when President Duterte says that he wants to have constructive engagement with the UN, but then the government would not allow UN human rights investigators into the country? I mean, it's just parang contradicting.
No, it's not. And that's why I have to clarify that when you send in special rapporteurs, that's pursuant to what is known as special procedure of the UN Human Rights Council. There are two types of rapporteurs, thematic or country. But the rule as far as the special procedure is concerned is that you cannot compel a state to accept investigators. Now, they do have that sovereign decision, and the UN will not make any judgment at all if a state does not allow investigators to come in. But you see, the special procedures under the UN Human Rights Council is only one of the forums as far as human rights is concerned. No? There's periodic review, and there's also the High Commissioner on Human Rights. No? So we have committed basically to open lines of dialogue with human rights institutions within the UN system without having to allow rapporteurs to come in under the special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council. So to put it basically in more simple terms, hindi lang naman special procedures or the sending of special rapporteurs ang option in collaborating and discussing human rights issue. We can discuss it with the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, and I think that's the option that we have done, as well as opening lines of communication with the human rights offices within the UN system itself, not necessarily the special procedure.
So you're saying that you would let other officials, not the rapporteurs, you would let them into the country to make their independent investigations?
It's not an investigation because only rapporteurs conduct the investigation. But what we have committed is we have opened lines of dialogue. So we will continue our constructive dialogue. We will entertain their suggestions, possibly enforce them, because that's how the UN works in the first place. Remember, as an international organization, the UN never sought to be an alternative to the exercise of state sovereignty. So we will deal with issues on human rights on this in this manner. Let's talk about it. We listen, and if there's merit in it, we will adopt suggestions that you make. But there's nothing in the UN system itself which compels us to accept rapporteurs into the country.
Okay. Pero ni-reject na rin ni President Duterte because you mentioned the UN High Commission on Human Rights. President Duterte has also rejected the findings of that office, right?
Well, yes, he has, but conducting constructive dialogues with other human rights offices of the UN, no? And also with that office, no, because she is the highest UN official, no. So as far as dialogue is concerned, we're open to it. If they think that the war on drugs could be run in a manner that with least intrusion into private rights, into human rights, then we will listen, because the war against drug is being fought not just in the Philippines, but by every single country on earth, except those that have actually legalized them.
Mm-hmm. There's actually a criticism by human rights advocates on how President Duterte defined human rights, because President Duterte defined human rights as protection from illegal drugs, criminality, and terrorism. But these human rights advocates say that the definition begins with the right to life. And basically they're saying that there's so many thousands of Filipinos have been killed under this war on drugs without having been afforded due process. Secretary Harry Roque, you were a former human rights lawyer. I mean, what is your definition of human rights?
You know, that's semantics, because the war on illegal drugs themselves and terrorism pose a threat to the right to life. So by declaring war on illegal drugs and on terrorism, the president is upholding the human rights of innocent people, no? And of course, this obligation to protect and promote the right to life against illegal drugs and terrorism It's an obligation not just of the Philippine state, but of every single state, especially those that are members of the UN, because we do have a mandate in the United Nations for states to take positive action against drugs, and that's based in Austria. No? In the same way that the Security Council and the General Assembly have time and again devoted resolutions against the fight against international terrorism. Senator Lacson, for instance, says that his bill, the anti-terror law, was precisely based on several UN Security Council that compels states to pass legislation that would provide for effective steps to be taken against international terrorism.
But going by that very basic definition, that the human rights begins with the right to life, shouldn't it be too hard to abide by the conditions of the EU Parliament and US Congress instead of daring them to implement their economic sanctions?
You see, you're assuming that the fight against against illegal drugs and terrorism does not uphold the right to life. It does. You go against illegal drugs because illegal drugs destroy the right to life. In the same way that terrorists that sow terror in the minds of the public, among others by murder and targeted political assassinations, pose a threat to the right to life. Now, perhaps the confusion is in the fact that international law does not absolutely prohibit the use of force on the part of state actors. You can use force to the extent of force of even having a death if there is a necessity for the use of force and if the means employed is proportional. Now, the drug war, of course, has had deaths, but you have to view them on a case-to-case basis because the issue, of course, is was the use of force necessary and was it proportional? And you can't make a generalization that every single one of them is not proportional and was not necessary. And that is why the Department of Justice created an interagency committee to look into every single case of killing involving connected with the drug war with the end view of fulfilling the state obligation to provide victims of violations of human rights an adequate domestic remedy should there be evidence indicating that there was no necessity and there was no proportionality in the resultant killing.
Okay, I think we would have to leave it at that, and I think human rights advocates and you would have to agree to disagree because we're, I think, running out of time and we still have a lot of issues that we need to discuss. Okay, next, there has been a huge issue in the past couple of days about a possibility of a no election scenario in 2022. I know you already said that the palace rejects this, that there will be no election in 2022 due to the pandemic. But is there any other scenario for us to not have an election in 2022? Or are you saying that under no scenario will we have no election in 2022?
For as long as we are under the 1987 Constitution, any move not to have the elections in 2022 would be unconstitutional and therefore illegal. Mm-hmm. What are the scenarios? Well, if the 1987 Constitution ceases to have legal effect, and that can only happen if there is a revolutionary government, which is difficult to fathom, no? Given that the president is the constitutional government. So it's a contradiction in terms. Unlike Cory Aquino, who was not declared the winner by the COMELEC in her electoral struggle against Marcos, the president, without a doubt, won the mandate. No? So why would he even consider a revolutionary government? No? So as far as he is concerned, as the constitutional leader, he will discharge his constitutional obligation to implement the laws, and he will make sure that elections are held in 2022. Besides, the president is a seasoned politician. He knows the Filipinos love elections, and you're really signing your political death warrant if you prevent the people from exercising a democratic right that they so love every 3 years.
Okay. Is the president then running for vice president in 2022? There has been talks of him running together with his daughter, Davao Mayor Sara Duterte, with Davao Mayor Sara Duterte being the presidential runner and him being the vice presidential runner.
Well, I do not know for sure, But what I know for sure is the president is tired of politics. He has said time and again that he's had it, he's served his time, he has reached the apex of his political career, and all that he wants now is to address the problems of the country, including the pandemic and, of course, the problem as far as illegal drugs is concerned, and the issue of corruption, particularly in Philippines.
Okay, now speaking of elections, one other hot topic right now in relation to the 2019 local elections is the expected proclamation of the Duterte Youth Party List by the COMELEC. But there has been quite a loud protest over this by youth groups in particular, saying that this party list is unregistered and that the representative is not a youth, basically. So, I mean, is the palace concerned? I mean, I know this is a decision that is to be made by the COMELEC, but is the palace concerned over the backlash among the youth who may be supporters of President Duterte?
Number one, Cardenas has been disqualified. Referring to Cardenas, there's no way he can sit as party list representative representing the youth, and the COMELEC has ruled in that manner. No? But the COMELEC, I understand, has also recognized that a party list group representing the young people, albeit called the Duterte Youth, is a valid sector that should be represented in Congress. No? I don't think anyone can complain with the proposition that the youth should be represented in Congress. No? If the far left can have a youth representative, why not those who are not belonging to the far left? No? We simply cannot limit the right to representation to the far left, no, and not to everyone else in society. No? Now, is the president concerned? Well, only the COMELEC can rule on this matter. The president cannot rule on this matter. The president can only enforce the decisions of the COMELEC if need be. No? So the COMELEC is a constitutional body again, and people will just have to abide with the rulings of the COMELEC. If they do not agree with the ruling that the youth should be represented, not just by the far left, but by other groups, then they should go to the Supreme Court. But I doubt if they will win on that particular argument.
So in other words, hindi po makikialam si President Duterte sa issue
Hindi
na.
po. Wala naman kaming jurisdiction talaga. COMELEC po yan.
Okay. Now still on elections, back in 2016, of course, the presidential election back then was very contentious, and President Duterte has admitted to using online trolls for that election campaign. But he said that the government right now isn't anymore employing online trolls. So kumbaga ang sinasabi niya, nung election, yes, pero ngayon, hindi. However, Facebook has shut down a number of pro-Duterte Facebook groups and even traced them back to the military and the police. So, I mean, what does this reveal about the government's propaganda machine? People saying that this proves that the government has indeed online trolls, and critics questioning whether the government is using public funds to hire these online trolls.
I'm sorry, Barnes, that's one conclusion after the other. Number one, I dispute that the president ever admitted into using trolls. What he admitted to was to resorting to social media as part of his campaign. In fact, he's had to resort to social media because established media did not give him enough space. They, of course, favored the administration candidate, Mar Rojas. No? So he had no choice but to resort to social media. He never, ever admitted into using trolls. And I stand by that, because as spokesperson, one way by which I know I'm talking on behalf of the president is I have an index on everything that he said, and I can even illustrate the instances when he justified the use of social media, because all the parties resorted to it. In fact, the Liberal Party spent more than he did because he relied more on volunteers. Now, as far as the Facebook decision is concerned, well, remember the Facebook decision is based on people that it relies on. The representative of in the Philippines happens to be a supporter of the Liberal Party. The two alleged fact checkers hate the Duterte administration, and I don't think anyone can dispute it. It's Rappler and Vera Files. So, what do you expect from fact checkers who are biased against the administration, and from a Facebook representative who is a true who is a yellow all the way, not to the core? They will take steps to take down pages supportive of the administration. Now, as far as the specific pages that were closed, the Armed Forces has said that none of it is an official page of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. May perhaps some members of the Armed Forces could have personal pages, but there is no prohibition as far as our civil laws are concerned on government employees from having social media pages. I have my own social media page, and to prohibit me from having my own personal social media page would, of course, be tantamount to violating my freedom of expression. So, not that the Facebook has concluded can be attributed to the state itself, perhaps to individuals who happen to be working for the state but not acting for and on behalf of the state.
Pero Sec, hindi lang yata fake news yung naging issue. Since you mentioned the fact checkers, it's coordinated, inauthentic behavior.
Well, whatever the conclusions are entitled to hold it, no? But what's important is they did not shut down any official page of the Armed Forces, any official state page of the Republic, and even in the case of the military personnel who was running his own page, that's his lookout because that's his personal page.
Are you saying categorically now that the Philippine government does not run troll farms?
We do not run troll farms. It is the administration of the past that ran them and used it effectively against the Philippine government. And of course, you have opposition figures acknowledging that they're funding Facebook pages right now, which are allied with the opposition. We have never made an admission that any page has been funded by the administration.
Oh, okay. So you're accusing the opposition of instead of running troll farms.
Oh, they have admitted that they have financed bloggers against this administration, and they have admitted openly.
All right. On the I'm gonna move on from that because Paul is saying that we only have 10 more minutes. The ombudsman has new policies that prevent the public from accessing SALNs of public officials without the approval of those very public officials, and has also a new policy wherein there will be no lifestyle checks of public officials. Does the palace agree with these new policies, or does it go against the president's fight against corruption? Because he's always said, not a whiff of corruption.
The president's view on the acts of the ombudsman is utterly immaterial because the ombudsman, like the COMELEC, again, is a constitutional body. Now, if the ombudsman were under the office of the president, perhaps the president's opinion would matter because he is still head of the executive branch of government. No? But unfortunately, the ombudsman does not form part of the executive branch of government. We have to respect the positions adopted by the constitutional body, which is the office of the ombudsman. So we would just have to respect the decision. If people disagree with it, then there's remedies available for them to exhaust.
But would you agree that this affects the image of the president as a fighter of corruption?
Certainly not, because he did not decide in that manner. It is the ombudsman, an independent constitutional body, that decided accordingly.
Okay. All right. So then what you're saying is that there's nothing you can do about policies that are being made by the office of the ombudsman.
Certainly, because they are a constitutional body.
All right then. Okay. Let's move on to the Congress then. Congress has just approved, lower house has just approved the 4.5 trillion budget for the 2021 on the committee level, not yet approved, of course. But it's been approved on the committee level. Now, the criticism has been, without much changes, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the criticism has been, from the very start of the budget deliberations, is that the health budget has been slashed when compared to the budget of 2020, when combined with the original budget that has been appropriated in the Bayanihan 1 and the Bayanihan 2. And it turns out that it's just the fifth biggest allocation in the overall budget. And we have the military, with increased budget. So, I mean, does this validate the criticisms that the government has misplaced priorities, especially when it comes to, solving the pandemic?
Certainly not, no? Because under the Constitution, education really is supposed to be number one, and that's been implemented. Now, the fact that DOH is only number five does not mean it does not have the second highest allocation. Why? Because as far as infrastructure, for instance, are concerned, much of it actually is lodged with the DPWH as well as with the Department of National Defense, because the National Disaster Risk Management Council, no, which actually procures a lot of supplies for the pandemic, falls under the Department of National Defense. So you have infrastructure in DPWH, you have acquisition of pandemic-related items under the NDRMC, and of course you also have funding intended for the pandemic in the budget of the DILG, as well as in the budget of local government units. So if you were to add up everything, I'm sure the Department of Health would have the second largest budget. It's just that in our form of government, depending on the kind of project, it would be a different office that would implement it. And the reason, for instance, why the UH does not implement infrastructure projects is it simply does not have no way to implement them. No? The building of hospitals, the building of temporary isolation facilities, those would fall under the budget of the DPWH. No? The procurement of PPEs, again, no, is now being procured by the DBM, no? Because under the Bayanihan Act, we have to expedite the process. So part of it also is in the DBM procurement service. And of course, as I said, no, there's the NDRMMC because the pandemic also falls within the jurisdiction of the NDRMMC.
Okay.
But I'm sure if you add up everything, education would have the second highest budget. And not education. Health have the second highest budget after education. But we can't do anything about the fact that education has to have the highest budget because that's in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. And one of your critics, obviously, has been Vice President Leni Robredo, and you've kind of had, the last couple of weeks, sort of a word war with her. You said that she is criticizing without giving suggestions. Now she's saying that you should review her suggestions. And to be fair, Harry Roque, she has made suggestions.
That's a new suggestion. We've implemented all her suggestions. One suggestion is that the response should be based on medicine. What are we doing all this time? What are we basing our decisions on how to prevent the disease? Aren't we basing it on the advice of doctors and scientists, epidemiologists, mathematicians? So we're open to suggestion, but please make it new. The problem with the liberals and the yellows is they were precisely rejected by the electorate because they have this feeling na sila lang yung tama. And she's exhibiting the same trademark again. We're the only ones right in this pandemic issue. No? And what I'm saying is, hello, you have not heard anything from you guys, nothing that we have not been implementing in the first place. So I dare her, give a suggestion that we have not been implementing. No? But for every suggestion that she makes, I can show documented proof that it's been implemented. That's a challenge.
Mm-hmm. But the problem, Secretary Roque, just to be fair, is because President Duterte, whenever he has his speeches late Monday evening or early Tuesday morning, he's been saying that the only hope that we have is a vaccine. So there is this impression or perception that what the government is doing right now is just to wait for a vaccine, and that is the only solution that the government has.
Let me ask you, Barnes, is that true? Is that what we do in the IATF? Is that the reason why we spend 12 hours, 2 times a week, discussing how to wait for the vaccine? Certainly not, no? That's a figure of speech. Ultimately, what the president means is the solution to this pandemic is a vaccine, which no one can deny. But you see, it's unfair for the vice president to every government official for her to say that we're just waiting for a vaccine and doing nothing meanwhile to manage it. We have 1.7 death mortality rate, which shows that we have been managing the situation. No? We may not have managed, for instance, the numbers as best as our neighbors, but for as long as we limit the deaths, and that's what's important because people are scared of pandemics because they could die. So you be the judge, Barnes. Are we just waiting around for a vaccine, or have we actually taken steps to address the pandemic?
Oh,
What
okay.
happened to Bayanihan One? What happened to Bayanihan Two? Isn't this a way of addressing the pandemic and the
Oh,
stimulus package in the budget? So come on. So that's why, sinasabi ko na nga lang is I'm dismissive now of the Vice President's claim until she can give me a suggestion that we have not yet implemented. No? And of course, I come to the conclusion that she's really politicking this early. And I think it will boomerang against her because people simply don't like people politicking at the time of pandemic.
mhm. Oh, okay then. What are the further steps then that the government will be taking in the next month? What are the quarantine measures going to look like starting because the latest quarantine measures will end at the end of September. So we have new quarantine measures starting in October, and I understand that you are going into phase 3 of the National Action Plan. So what
Yes.
is it going to look like starting in October? Can we expect it? For example, Hong Kong has already announced, Carrie Lam has just announced that Hong Kong has been able to contain its third wave of the coronavirus outbreak. Can we expect something like that?
We're still on the first wave. You see, we're still in the first wave, but it is on its way down. And one of the new things that we will be adopting in terms of classification is we're replacing case doubling rate with attack time, no? And 2-week attack time. No? And I will show the graph used by Secretary Duque in his presentation before the press and showing that the numbers, in fact, are decreasing. And I think on a daily basis, we've moved from 3,000 to about 2,000 a day. No? And of course, even the R naught has become one or less than one. Now, I just received a report from the UP Octa, again showing that there's been a substantial decrease in the spread of the pandemic, no? Which shows again that the vice president is wrong. No? All I'm saying is to be fair, don't say we're not doing anything when it has occupied the time of every single cabinet member sitting in the IATF for 12 hours at least twice a week. But it's not right that we also say that even the career officers and employees of government are just sitting around for a vaccine. Simply not fair, and I will call her out because she's wrong.
Okay, sorry. I don't think that the question was answered. So, what are the new steps that will be taken starting in October?
Right now, we're encouraging people. We know already how to contain the disease. We know the non-pharmacological steps that we must take: the wearing of masks, washing of hands, social distancing. We need to tell the people that it is okay to live with the coronavirus because there's a way of protecting yourself against it. And meanwhile, we need to work for a living because we may not die of COVID, but we will die of hunger and without livelihood. So there's a campaign on Ingat Buhay para sa Hanap Buhay. No? And in addition to that, of course, we are starting with the third National Action Plan, which of course prioritizes now the reopening of the economy without sacrificing health concerns of the people. No, I don't think we have enough time really for me to discuss the entirety of the second and the third action plan. But needless to say, the existence of these plans belies and proves that the vice president, does not know what she's talking about.
I'm sure you will touch on these plans in your regular press briefings, and I know that you have to go, but allow me to ask you just one final question, and this is going to be about Manila Bay Sands. And I know President Duterte has already said that he's pleased with how it all turned out, but just very recently, I think it was only yesterday, Environment Secretary Roy Simatu ordered the operations in Cebu of the dolomite miners halted, and that the DNR is investigating the damage that has been done in Cebu for the mining of dolomite for Manila Bay. So with this development, I mean, the question is, was there even an environmental impact study before this was done?
The DNR enforces the rule on EIAs. Of course, there was. But as soon as there were complaints that the extraction from Manila Bay resulted in damage to the environment, I commend Secretary Simantu for starting this investigation, because a lesser mortal would rush it under the rug. No? Because after all, it is his pet project. No? But the fact that he is investigating shows that the DNR knows its mandate and it is performing its mandate, including the conduct of an environmental impact assessment before they embark on this beach nourishment project.
But
It's
that's
not an irrigation campaign. It's nourishment. It's intended to prevent further soil erosion, and it is also a means of controlling flood.
I understand what you're saying, Secretary Roque, but doesn't it mean that there was no environmental impact assessment before they did this? Because now they're parang pabaliktad po yung nagiging proseso ngayon.
It's absolutely not. I don't know if you're familiar with EIAs, no, but EIAs were done on the project in Manila Bay itself. Now, I think what is being investigated now is the allegation that in extracting the dolomite, there were damage to the environment. No? But the mining itself in Alcoy, Cebu, has been covered by an EIA because that has been an undertaken, conducted for the longest time, as in fact, Alcoy relies exclusively on dolomite mining.
All right, we're going to have to leave it at that, Secretary Roque, because I know that you have to go. You have visitors in your house, and we really we really appreciate your time, to be doing this for us on a Saturday evening. So thank you so much for your time. And
yes.
Yes.
I also appreciate the fact that you took time out to talk to us, and I welcome further engagements with your program.
Thank you, Secretary Roque. And of course, thank you so much to our viewers on Facebook. My apologies. Once again, I'm always apologizing every week that we were not able to get to your comments and your question. But thank you so much for tuning in to our program. Do catch us every Saturday at 6 p.m. live on the Facebook page of Now You Know. Again, my name is Barnaby Lo. This is Viewpoint. Now You Know.